Hello folks, and welcome back to Noob-Splaining. And here I'm going to push through onto the final part of the origins of the Deathwing. So, no preamble again, let's just get on with it, shall we? Anger and impatience drove Two Heads talking towards the sound of the pain. By the bank of the river, in the shadow of a monstrous factory, he saw that a group of bluecoats had pinned an old man against the wall and was slowly and surely beating him to death with their truncheons. One of their number held a lantern, occasionally giving a calm, precise order. "Talk seditious nonsense, would you?" said one bravo. His stroke ended with the crack of breaking ribs. The old man groaned and fell to his knees. The other bluecoats merely laughed. "Preach heresy against the imperial cult and the warriors from the sky, eh? What makes you old fools do it? By the Emperor, I thought we'd got the last of you." Their victim looked up at them. "You are deluded. The warriors from the sky would not have built this place and herded us here the way elks are herded to the slaughter. Nor would they have broken the burial mounds of our people. Your masters are evil spirits summoned by the hill clans, not true sky warriors. Deathwing will return and rend them asunder." "Silence, blaspheming no-name," said the leader of the Bluecoats. "You wish to prove your courage, do you? Perhaps we should return to the old ways, drunkard, and practice the weasel claw ritual on you." The old man coughed blood. "Do what you will. I am Morning Star, of the line of Running Deer and Silver Elk. I have the witching sight. I tell you that the spirits walk. Ancient powers stalk the land. The red star burns bright in the sky. A time of trouble is coming." "Is that why you chose to start ranting this night? I had thought the only spirits that talked to you came from a bottle," said another bluecoat, kicking Morningstar in the ribs. The old man groaned. Two Heads talking made his way forward through the mist till he emerged into the lantern light. The bluecoat leader spoke to him. "Go away, Buck. This is Warrior Lodge business. If you don't want to join this drunkard in the river, you'll leave now."
"You dishonour the idea of the Warrior Lodge,"
said Two Heads talking quietly.
"Depart now, and I will spare you. Remain a heartbeat longer, and I will surely grant you death."
The old man looked up at him, awestruck. Two Heads talking could see the winged skull tattoo of a shaman on his forehead. A few bravos laughed. Some, the wiser ones, heard the soft menace in the marine's voice and backed away. The leader gestured for the bluecoats to attack. "Take him!" Two Heads talking parried the swipe of a truncheon with his forearm. There was a metallic ring as the bludgeon snapped. He broke the bravo's nose against the butt of his forceaxe, then lashed out with his foot, driving it into another bluecoat's stomach with inhuman force. As the man bent double, the librarian chopped down on his neck, breaking it. The bluecoats swarmed over him now. Their truncheons were as ineffective as twigs against a bear. A few tried to grab his arms and immobilize him. He shrugged them off easily, swinging killing blows with weapon and elbow. Where he struck, men died. As the battle lust swept over him, he felt the bound spirit slip away. He knew that he stood, revealed in his true form. The last of the bluecoats turned to run. Two Heads talking hooked an arm around his neck and twisted. There was a crunch of shattering vertebrae. The old man gazed on him with religious intensity. "The spirit spoke truthfully," he said, as if he did not quite believe it. He reached out and touched him, making sure he was real. "You have come at last to free the people from their bondage to the false emperor and lead them back to the plains. What is your name, Sky Warrior?"
"In my youth, it was Two Heads talking, apprentice to Spirit Hawk. When I entered the service of the true Emperor, I took the name Lucian."
He could see tears running down the old man's scarred cheeks.
"Tell me, old man, what has happened to our folk? How did they come to fall so low?"
"It began when I was a buck," said Morningstar, wiping his face. "One summer night, the sky burned, and there was a great roaring. A trail of fire raced across the sky, and there was an explosion. Where we are now was a vast crater, and in the centre, where the temple of the four-armed emperor stands, was a great red-hot pile of metal. Some people thought the Sky Warriors had returned, that the roaring was the voice of the Thunderbird. The shamans knew this could not be so, for Deathwing returns only once every 100 years, in autumn, and it had been only 50 years since the Red Star was last visible. We were pleased because we thought we might ride Deathwing. Most of us had reckoned on being old men when the Sky Warriors came again. Those who met our chiefs were not the armoured warriors of legend. They were feeble, pale-skinned men who claimed they had come from the Emperor to show us the way to build an earthly paradise. They preached the virtues of tolerance and brotherly love and an end to warfare. The chiefs sent them packing. which was a mistake, for when honeyed words did not succeed, they tried force of arms. They allied with the hill clans and gave them metal blades which our weapons could not withstand. Eventually, clans were forced to trade for the new weapons in order to withstand their enemies. Tales were told of how witching spirits with 4 arms and terrible claws destroyed our warriors. Soon, the pretenders ruled the plains, taking slaves and destroying utterly those who opposed them. Then came the building of this great city using slave labour and paying the freemen in trade tokens. Suddenly, the old man's eyes went wide with horror. He was looking past 2 heads talking and into the night. The librarian turned. From the mist, shapes emerged. One was the fat man who earlier had been riding in the palanquin. Flanking him were 2 huge 4-armed figures. Their carapaces glistened like oil. They raised large claws which glittered in the moonlight. "We would have told you all this if you had only asked," said the fat man, gazing at 2 heads talking with his dark, magnetic eyes. The librarian flexed his fingers, and his force axe hummed a song of death in his head. "It was in the time of Commander Aradil, 100 summers gone," said Bloody Moon. "We were aboard the battle barge Angelus Morte on Sector Edge Patrol when the alarms went off. Sensor probes indicated that a space hulk had dropped from warp space near us. Deep scanning revealed nothing. We were ordered to investigate. We crouched within the boarding torpedoes and were fired at the hulk. It was unpowered and dark when we disembarked, so helmets light on. We moved to secure the perimeter. We met no resistance, but as per the Codex Astartes, we proceeded with extreme caution. We identified the hulk as Prison of Lost Souls, an appropriate name as it turned out. We moved nervously through the shadowy corridors, for the taint of the warp still hung about the craft. It made us uneasy. At first, there was no sign of danger. Then we came across the bodies of some space wolves. They had been riddled with bolter fire. We could not guess how long they had lain there. Perhaps since the Hulk had last entered normal space, but that might have been 10 years or 10,000. We did not know. The tides of warp space are unpredictable, and time flows strangely there. Brother Sergeant Conrad ordered us to be wary. Then a terrible thing occurred. A space wolf's corpse sat upright, its eyes glowing crimson. "You are doomed," it told us. "Every one of you will die as I have." We riddled it with fire from our weapons, but still, its horrible whispers echoed in our minds. We began to fall back. All around us, blips suddenly appeared on our sensors. They were running parallel to us, trying to cut us off from the boarding torpedoes. At corridor intersections, we caught sight of armoured figures. We exchanged a few shots with them. I hit one and heard it scream over the comlink. They were using the same frequencies as we were. When we realised that, our blood ran cold. We asked ourselves, could these be Marines? We did not have long to wait for an answer. They swarmed down the corridor towards us in a vast wave. They were garbed in the armour of Marines, but they were horribly mutated. Some clutched rusty bolters in tentacles instead of hands. Some had faces that were moist and green and slimy like toads. Some had claws and extra limbs. Some dragged themselves along, leaving a trail of mucus behind them. The mark of chaos was upon them. They called on Horus and those powers that are better not named, and we knew then they were renegades, survivors from the age of heresy who had pacted with chaos in exchange for eternal life. The fighting became close and heavy. They had the weight of numbers, but we had our Terminator armour and the strength of righteousness. For a moment, it looked as though they might overwhelm us, but then our thunder hammers and lightning claws came into play, and we cut through them inexorably. They fought like demons, and they had the strength of the damned, but eventually we won. I stood looking down at the body of my last foe, and a thought occurred to me. This man had once been a Marine like myself. He had undergone the same training and indoctrination as I had. He had sworn to serve the Emperor, and yet he had betrayed humanity. How could this be? How could a true Marine become forsworn? It seemed unlikely that he would suddenly turn his back on the pattern of a lifetime and pact with the darkness. What had chaos to offer him? Wealth? We have no use for the baubles that other men covet. We already have the finest of everything that a man could wish for. Sensual gratification? We are taught its transitory nature. Power? We know true power, which is the will of the Emperor. Who among us could equal his sacrifice? No. As I stood over his body, I came to understand. He had deviated, not in one leap, but in small steps, by increments. First, he had come to place trust in the War Master, an easy step, for was not Horus the chief champion of the Emperor? Then he had come to follow the War Master. Who would not? A soldier follows his commander. Then he had come to believe Horus divine. An easy mistake. Was not the great heretic one of the Primarchs of the first founding? Gifted with godlike powers, second only to the Emperor himself? Thus did he stray from the path of truth, till eventually he lost both his life and soul. It is a way that is open to anyone, one small mistake leading to another, until at last the great error is reached. This I came to realise as I studied the body of the renegade on the prison of lost souls. I resolved then and there to submit myself to the Emperor's will. I knew that all our regulations and our codes have a purpose, and it is not for us to question them, for they keep us from the path of the deviant. Around the fire there was silence. Cloudrunner could tell that Bloody Moon's words had touched a chord within the Marines. He found himself examining his own conscience for signs of heresy. The implication of Bloody Moon's tale was quite clear. If they lapsed from the service of the Emperor, they were taking the first step down the road to damnation. He had also reminded them that they were Marines, the chosen of the Emperor. If they did not keep the faith, who would? For a long time, all was quiet. Then Weaselfierce indicated his wish to talk.
I will speak of death,
He said.
the death of men and worlds.
Two Heads Talking felt the impact of the fat Magus's will like a physical blow. The great dark eyes seemed to swell, to become bottomless pits into which the librarian fell. At his feet, Morningstar whimpered. With a wrench, the Marine broke the psychic contact, thankful that his librarian's armour was equipped with a psychic hood. The Magus was strong, and Two Heads Talking was already tired. The Steelers raced toward him. The librarian raised his storm bolter and sent a hail of shells blazing out. Tracer fire ripped the knight apart. The leading Genestealer was shredded by the heavy bullets. The other dodged with inhuman speed. Morningstar leapt between the librarian and his assailant. A claw flickered, and the old man's body was torn in two. Two Heads Talking lashed out with his axe, willing it to strike hard, and its blade burned coldly as it passed through the Steeler's neck. He leapt back to avoid its reflexive death strike. The Magus laughed. You cannot escape. Why struggle? The fat man concentrated, and a halo of power played around his head. The librarian hosed him down with fire, but some force intercepted the shells, causing them to explode harmlessly a few feet from their target. Two Heads Talking strode forward, swinging the axe. He felt his own power build within him as the blade arced towards his target. Something stopped it a foot away from the Magus's head. Great muscles bulged under his arm as he forced it forward. Servo motors whined as they added their strength to his. Slowly, inexorably, the Marine forced the blade towards his head, and sweat ran down the fat man's brow as he concentrated. A look of fear passed across his face. He could not save himself, and he knew it. He gave a single shriek as his concentration lapsed. The force axe sheared through him from head to groin. Two Heads Talking felt the Magus's psychic death scream echo through the night. He sensed hundreds of minds answer it. In the distance, through the deadening curtain of mist, he heard the sound of Scut coming ever closer. Knowing his only chance of survival lay in swift flight, Two Heads Talking turned and ran.
Our world is dead,
said Weaselfierce. Some Marines muttered about the fact that he was addressing them directly, rather than keeping to the ritual. He silenced them with a short, chopping gesture of his right hand. When he spoke again, his tone was scathing and savage.
This ritual is a sham. It comes from a time that is ended. Why pretend otherwise? You may wish to delude yourselves by keeping with the old ways, but I do not. You can speak in parables about our oaths to the Emperor, the horror of the Steelers, or the nature of damnation. I choose to speak the truth. Our people are dead or enslaved, and we sit here like old women, asking ourselves what to do. Have we been put under a spell? When were we ever so indecisive? A true warrior has no choice in this matter. We must avenge our people. Our weapons must taste enemy blood. It would be the coward's way not to face them.
But if we fail, began Bloody Moon.
If we fail, so be it. What have we to live for? How many summers have we left before we die of old age, or are encased in the cold metal body of a living dreadnought?
He fell silent and glared around the fire. To Cloudrunner's surprise, he looked down, and the fury seeped out of him.
I am old,
he said softly.
Old and tired. I have seen more than 200 summers. In a few more, I will be dead anyway. I had hoped to gaze again on my kin before then, but it is not to be. This is my only regret.
Cloudrunner could see the weariness in him, felt it echo in his own mind. Every man about the fire had served the Emperor for centuries. Their lifespans increased by the process that turned them into Marines.
If I had remained among the people,
Weaselfierce said,
I would be dead by now. I chose another path. I have lived long, longer perhaps, than any mortal should. It is time for an ending. We're better than here, on our homeworld, among the bones of our kin. The day of the Plains people is done. We can avenge them, and we can join them. If we fall in combat, we shall have had warriors' deaths. I wish to die as I have lived, weapons in hand, foes before me. I believe that this is what we all want. Let us do it.
All was quiet, except the crackling of the fire. Cloudrunner looked from face to face, and saw death was written in each of them. Weasel Fierce had voiced what they had all felt since first seeing the shattered lodges. They had become wraiths, walking in the ruins of elder days. There was nothing left here for them, except memories. If they departed now, all that loomed before them was old age and inevitable death. This way, at least, their ending would have a meaning.
I say we go in. If the contamination has not spread too far, we can free any survivors,
said Lame Bear. Cloudrunner looked at Bloody Moon. Providing we command Deathwing to virus bomb the planet if we fail, he said. The rest of the warriors put their right fists forward, signifying assent. They all looked at him, waiting to see what he had to say. He felt once more the pressure of command fall on him. He considered the destroyed lodges and his own loss, and weighed them against his imperial duty. Nothing could bring back the Plains people, but perhaps he could save their descendants. But that was not all there was to it, he realised. He wanted the satisfaction of meeting his foes face to face. He was angry. He wanted to make the Steelers suffer for what they had done, and he wanted to be there when they did. He wanted vengeance for himself and for his people. It was as simple as that. Such a decision was not the correct one for an Imperial officer, but it was the way of his clan. In the end, to his surprise, he found out where his true loyalty lay. I say we fight, he said at last, but we fight as the warriors of the people. This battle is not for the Emperor, it is for our murdered clans. Our last battle shall be fought in accordance with our ancient ways. Let us perform the rite of Deathwing. Two Heads Talking ran for his life. Through the darkened streets, Genestealers pursued, loping along, swift and deadly. He sensed their presence all around. He leapt over a pile of rubbish which lay in his path and swept round a corner into a main road. Two workers poked their heads through a doorway to see what was going on. They swiftly withdrew. Two Heads Talking ran wearily. His heart was pounding and his breathing was ragged. The strain of maintaining the spell of concealment for so long had sapped his strength. He wondered how long he could keep up this pace. He risked a swift glance over his shoulder. A Genestealer had just rounded the corner. He fired his stone bolter at it, but his shot was inaccurate and the Stealer lurched back into cover. Sensing danger in front of him, he turned. From out of a shadowy doorway, a Stealer uncoiled. He had just enough time to raise his force axe before it sprang. He thrust the blade out before him, chopping into the monster's chest. The momentum of the thing's charge knocked him over. A claw cut into his arm, searing it with pain. If his blow had not landed cleanly, he realised he would have been dead. Ignoring the pain, he rolled onto his belly, catching a glimpse of his pursuers as they charged. He squeezed the trigger of his bolter and stitched a line of fire across their chests. The strength of the armour allowed him to hurl off the ambusher's carcass with ease. He continued on his way. Not much further, he thought, forcing himself to reel onward. He could see the huge walls jutting above nearby buildings. He recited a spell to free his mind of pain and made for the gates. His heart sank when he saw what awaited him, a mass of hunched, evil-faced men with dark, piercing eyes. Some held ancient-looking energy weapons, some gripped blades in their hands. Towering over them were pure-string Genestealers, flexing their claws menacing. Two Heads Talking came to a halt, facing his foes. For a moment they eyed each other in respectful silence. The librarian commended his spirit to the Emperor. Soon Deathwing would be carrying him off. His bolter was almost empty. With only his force axe, he knew he could not withstand so many. As if an unspoken signal, the Genestealers and their brutes surged forward. A bolt from an energy weapon burned into his armour, melting one of the skulls on his chest plate. He gritted his teeth and returned fire, cutting a great swathe of death. There was a loud click as his bolter jammed. He did not have time to clear it, so he charged to meet his foe, chanting his death chant. He rushed into a sea of bodies that pressed against him, hitting him with blades and rending claws. He summoned the last dregs of his strength to power his force axe and swung it in a great double arc. He lopped off heads and limbs with a will, but for every foe who fell, another stepped into place. He could not guard himself against all their blows, and soon he bled from scores of great wounds. Life fled from him, and overhead he thought he heard the beating of mighty pinions. Deathwing has come, he thought, just before a blow smashed into his head, and all consciousness fled. Cloudrunner paused briefly before he painted out his personal Cloud and Thunderbolt insignia on his armour's right shoulder. He felt changed. By blanking out his Imperial insignia, he had blanked out part of himself, cut himself off from part of his history. Slowly, he began to etch new totem signs on the armour, the marks of vengeance and death. As he did so, He felt the powers of the totem spirits begin to enter him. He looked at Weasel Fierce. The gaunt man had finished painting out all the icons on his armour. It was now white, the colour of death, except on his left shoulder, where the skull had been left unchanged. It seemed somehow appropriate. They performed a rite that had dated back to ancient times, before the Emperor had come to tame the Thunderbirds. Only once before had Cloudrunner ever seen it performed. As a boy, he had watched a party of old warriors sworn to vengeance paint their bodies white and go after a horde of Hill Clan raiders that had killed a small child. They had painted their bodies the funeral colour because they did not expect to return from facing so overwhelming a foe. Bloody Moon looked over from beside the fire, gave him a weak grin. Cloudrunner walked over to him. "Ready, old friend?" he asked. Bloody Moon nodded. Cloudrunner bent over the fire and put his hands into the ash. He pressed his palms, fingers together, flat against his face, making the sign of Deathwing on each cheek.
"I wish Two Heads Talking would return,"
said Bloody Moon, repeating Cloudrunner's gesture. "He may yet surprise you." Bloody Moon looked doubtful. Cloudrunner gestured for the warriors to assemble. They formed into a circle around the dead fire. One by one, they began to chant their death songs. Even as they carried him through the long steel corridors, Two Heads Talking knew he was dying. Life leaked from his wounds. With every drop of blood that dribbled over his bearers, he became weaker. It felt like some evil dream, being borne down dimly lit tunnels by the hunched, demonic figures of the Genestealer brood. The librarian watched these events through a fog of pain, wondering why he was still alive. Part of his mind realised that he was within whatever vessel had carried the brood to his homeworld. Agony lanced through him as one of his bearers jolted him slightly. It took all his willpower not to scream. They entered a long hall in which a hunched, dreadful figure waited. He was placed on the floor in front of it. It cocked its head to one side, studying him. Tears ran down the librarian's face from the pain as he forced himself to his feet. Genestealer guards raced towards him, but the huge creature glanced at them, and they froze in position. Two Heads Talking managed to stand unsteadily, knowing he faced a Genestealer patriarch. He had heard dim legends of such things, the progenitors of entire broods, the most ancient of their lines. He looked into his enemy's eyes. He felt an almost electric shock pass through his body as their minds made contact. The librarian found himself confronted by a foe that was ancient, implacable, deadly. His mind reeled under the assault of its ferocious will. He felt an urge to kneel, to do homage to this ancient being. He knew that it was worthy of his respect. With an effort, he managed to restrain himself. He reminded himself that this was the being that destroyed his people. He made to throw himself at it, to aim a killing blow with his good arm. He sprang, but his legs gave way underneath him, and the patriarch caught him easily, almost gently, and held him at bay with its claws. The long ovipositor of its tongue flickered out, but did not touch him. Suddenly, he found himself engaged in a bitter psychic struggle. Tendrils of alien thought insinuated themselves into his mind. He blocked them, chopping them off with blades of his hatred. He countered with a psychic bolt of his own, but it was stopped by an ancient will that seemed impervious to outside influence. The patriarch exerted his full power, and Two Heads Talking felt his defences begin to buckle under the terrible pressure. The cold, focused power of the Genestealer was enormous. Even fresh, Two Heads Talking doubted he could have matched it. Now, strength fading because of his wounds, exhausted because of his earlier struggle, he could offer no contest at all. His outer screen fell, and the patriarch was within his mind, sorting through his memories, absorbing them into itself. For a second, while it was disorientated, he tried a psychic thrust. The Stealer countered it easily, but for a moment they met, mind to mind. Strange alien memories and emotions washed over the librarian, threatening to drown him. He saw the patriarch's past spread out before him. He saw the long trail that had led through despoiled worlds and past many children. He saw the hive world that he'd fled from in a fast ship just before the virus bombs fell. With a shock, he realised he had been there himself, on Thranx, and that the creature had recognised his aura from then. He saw the ship crippled by an Imperial battle barge, barely able to make the jump into warp space. He experienced the long struggle to return to normal space, and the frozen eternities it took to escape and crash land the crippled ship on a new virgin world. He saw the pitifully few survivors emerge, only a few pure strains and 3 hybrid techs. He saw them make axes from the wreckage of the ship for trade with the tribesmen, and he watched them start the long struggle to establish themselves in a hostile world. He was gratified as the web of psychic contact expanded with each new brood member. He felt cold satisfaction at the destruction of the tribes, and the knowledge that soon a new industrial base would be built. The ship would be repaired, new worlds to conquer would be within reach. For a bleak moment, despair filled Two Heads talking. He saw the Stealers planning to spread to and infect new worlds, and he could do nothing to stop this old, invincible entity. He almost gave in. He could see no way out. Death loomed, and that thought gave him pause. He knew what he must do. Part of him gave way before the Patriarch's assault. Another part willed his spirit towards oblivion. He stood once more in the cold place, sensed far off the spirit of the Emperor, bright and shining as a star. Near at hand were the angry ghosts. The Patriarch was a hungry, ominous presence, determined to enslave him. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the thunderous pinions of Deathwing coming to claim him. Too late, the Patriarch realised what he was doing and tried to break the link. Two Heads talking focused all his hatred, anger and fear and held the link open, a task made easier by the earlier intimate contact. The Patriarch struggled frantically but could not free himself. The wing beats came closer, drowning the librarian in a roar that might have been a hurricane or his own last breath. From the middle of a vortex of agony, he was borne up into the darkness. The maelstrom sucked in the Patriarch. It died, slain by the librarian's death agony. Briefly, Two Heads talking felt his foe vanish, felt the sense of loss from its brood. As the librarian's spirit rose higher, he reached out and touched the minds of his comrades. Bidding them farewell, telling them what to do. Then Two Heads talking knew no more. Cloudrunner felt the presence as he stared into the fire. He looked up and saw Two Heads talking standing before him. The librarian looked pale. His face was distorted by agony, his body gashed by dreadful wounds. He knew that this was a spirit vision, that the old shaman was dead. For a moment, he thought he heard the sound of titanic wing beats and saw the mightiest of thunderbirds soaring toward the moon. The presence vanished, leaving Cloudrunner feeling cold and alone. He shivered in the sudden chill. He knew he had been touched by Deathwing's passing. He looked toward the others and knew they had seen the same thing. He raised a hand in a gesture of farewell and then swept it down as a signal for the Marines to advance. Filled with determination, the white-armoured Terminators marched towards the distant city. Cloudrunner sat enthroned and looked down upon his visitors. His people were drawn up in long ranks, forming a corridor along which the Marines advanced warily. They were led by a captain and a librarian. From the doorway, the huge armoured form of a dreadnought performed overwatch. Cloudrunner found the sight of that old, familiar form comforting. He saw the uneasy, worshipful faces of his people look to him for reassurance. He kept his face grim and calm. He sensed the Battle Brothers' unease at the strangeness of the folk within the great lodge house. They held their bolters ready, as if expecting violence to erupt at any moment. Cloudrunner was glad to see them. Since Lame Bear's death, he had felt very alone. He spotted several familiar faces among the oncoming Imperial warriors. Memories of his old days in the chapter house flooded back. He took 3 deep breaths, touched the ancient white-painted suit beside him for luck, and then spoke. "Greetings, brother Sky Warriors," he said.
"Greetings, Brother Ezekiel,"
said the Marine leader suspiciously. Cloudrunner rubbed his facial scar tattoos with one gnarled hand, then grinned. "So, they made you a captain, eh, Broken Knife?"
"Yes, Brother Ezekiel, they made me a captain when you failed to return."
He paused, obviously waiting for an explanation. "It took you 10 years to come looking for the Dark Angel's honour suits?" the old man asked with a hint of mockery.
"There has been a war, a great migration of orcs through the Segmentum Obscura. The chapter was called to serve. During that time, the absence of our Terminators was felt grievously. You have an explanation for this?" "Of course." The Marine stared at Cloudrunner cold. It was as if he was a stranger to these grim youths, or worse, a traitor. He remembered the first time he had stood among Marines, and, for the first time in long years, became aware of their uncanny quality. He felt isolated and uneasy.
"These are not our people, Cloudrunner. What happened here?"
asked a deep rolling voice. He recognised it as the Dreadnoughts. Suddenly, he did not feel so alone. Hawk Talon was there, hooked into the life support systems of the Dreadnought. There was, at least, one person present who was on his side, who was old enough to understand. It was like their first meeting under the shadow of Deathwing, when he had sighted that one familiar face among strangers. "No, honoured forefather, they are not. They are the untainted survivors of the G-Stealer conquest." He heard the shocked murmur of the Marines, saw the way that they instinctively brought their weapons to bear on the lodge people.
"You had better explain, Brother Ezekiel,"
said Broken Knife. Cloudrunner found himself telling the tale to the astonished Marines. He told them of the Terminator Company's landing and of their discovery of the devastation that had been wrought by the Gene Stealers. He told them of the gathering and of the choice the warriors had made, of two heads talking in Spirit Walk and the Terminator's final march on the city. He spoke to them in the intricate syntax of the Imperial tongue, not the language of the Plains people. We marched through the Black Gates and were assaulted by Stealers. At first they seemed confused, as if they had suffered a great shock. They attacked in small groups, with no pattern and no guiding intelligence, and so we cut them down. We pushed through crowds of screaming people as we followed our librarian's locator beacon toward the city centre. Huge pure-string Stealers erupted from buildings as we advanced. They attacked with insane fury, but without thought, and so we bested them easily. In the centre of the city we found a temple, a building that obscenely parodied the Imperial cult, dominated by a huge four-armed statue of what was intended to be the Emperor. We toppled it into the street, and beneath it found an entrance into the underworld. Down we went into the cold metal corridors. We passed through airlocks and bulkheads. It was like a buried spacecraft. We still followed the locator figs, determined to reclaim Two Heads Talking armour and avenge his death. At first we made easy progress against isolated Stealer attacks, but then a change occurred. For a while, there was peace. We exchanged wary looks. Bloody Moon asked if we could possibly have killed them all. I can even now picture the puzzled look on his face. It was still there when a Stealer dropped through an air vent and took his head off. I blasted the thing with bolter fire, reducing it to bloody mush. Now the Stealers began to attack again, but this time their attacks were coordinated, guided by some malign intelligence. It was as if they had been leaderless for a time, but a new fiend had now taken charge. They flanked us through parallel corridors, dropped through vents in the ceiling. Hordes of Stealers and their human brood attacked from all sides. Waves of them scuttled forward with blinding speed, threatening to overwhelm us with sheer numbers. It was a horrible sight, watching those great armoured beasts race closer, ignoring their kin as they were cut down. Still, they came. Our point men and rearguard were ambushed and killed. The threats came so fast, we almost didn't have time to respond. I saw a score of them slain by flamer fire, and the stench that filled the air was indescribable. They spent their lives recklessly in their blind lust to kill us. There was a sense of terrible, oppressive anger in the air. It was as if they had a personal score with us, and were all prepared to die to settle it. Any other squad, even other Terminators, would have been beaten back by the sheer fury of their attack. But we wore the mark of Deathwing. Our funeral dirges had been sung. Fear was not in us, and we had our own scores to settle. We pushed forward, inch by torturous inch. Blood washed the corridors as we fought our way into a great central chamber. There we found the body of Two Heads Talking. He was dead, his body rent by great wounds. Nearby lay the body of the Patriarch, not a mark upon him. The hall was full of foes, pure strain and brood. A handful of us had found our way into the throne room. We faced many times our number. For a moment we stood exchanging glares. I think both sides sensed that they faced their ultimate enemy, that the outcome of that fight would decide the fate of this world. There was quiet in the hall, silence, except for the cycling of our breathers. I could hear my heart beating, my mouth felt dry, but I was strangely calm, sure that soon I would be greeting the spirits of my ancestors. The Stealers formed up, and we raised our bolters to the firing position. At an unspoken signal, they charged, mouths open but making no sound. A few of the brood fired ancient energy weapons. Beside me, a battle brother fell. We laid down a barrage of fire that tore the first wave to pieces. Nothing could have lived through it. Everything we fired at died, but there was just too many of them. They swarmed over us, and the final conflict began in earnest. I saw Weasel Fierce go down beneath a pile of Stealers. His bolter had jammed, but he fought on, screaming taunts and insults at his foes. The last I saw of him, he was tearing the head from a Stealer, even as it punched a claw through his chest. Thus passed the greatest warrior of our generation. Lame Bear and I fought back to back, circled about by our enemies. Power Glove and Power Sword smote the Stealers as we cut them down. If there had only been a few more pure strain, things would have gone differently that day. But most of them seemed to have died in the initial futile attacks. As it were, things were close. Lame Bear fell, wounded, and I found myself breast to breast with a huge, armoured horror. The leader knocked my sword from my hand with a sweep of a mighty claw. I thanked the Emperor for the digital weapons in my Power Glove and sprayed the monstrosity's eyes with poison needles, blinding it. In the brief respite, I found time to bring my Storm Bolter to bear and slay it. I looked around. Only Terminators stood in the hall. We whooped with joy to find ourselves still alive. But then the number of our fallen struck us, and we stood in appalled silence. Only 6 of us survived. We did not count the number of the Stealers fallen. In the world above, the children of the Plains people waited. A huge crowd had gathered outside the temple to see the outcome of our battle. They looked at us, awestruck. We had destroyed their temple and killed their gods. They did not know whether we were demons or redeemers. We looked on the weary creatures, who were the only remnants of our former clans. We had won, and we had reclaimed our world. Still, our victory seemed hollow. We had saved our descendants from the Stealers, but our way of life was gone. As we stood before the assembled throng, he struck me what we must do. The Emperor himself provided inspiration in that moment. I explained my plan to the others. We drove the crowds from the city and assembled them on the plain outside. We searched for traces of the brood among them, but there were none. The Stealer taint seemed to have been destroyed in our vengeance war. I walked through the factories and past the toppled chimneys. Then we took our flamers and burned the city to the ground. We divided the people up into 6 new tribes and said our goodbyes to each other, for we knew we would never likely meet again. Then we led our descendants away from the still blazing city. Lane Bear took his folk to the mountains. I brought my people to my old village, and we rebuilt it. I do not know what became of the others. I have told these people that I was sent by the Emperor to lead them back to the old ways. I have taught them how to hunt and fish and shoot in the old manner. We do battle with the other tribes. One day they will again be worthy of becoming Sky Warriors. Cloudrunner fell silent. He could see the Battle Brothers had been moved by his tale. Broken Knife turned to the librarian. Cloudrunner felt the pressure of mind-to-mind contact.
Brother Ezekiel speaks the truth, Brother Captain Gabriel,
said the librarian. Broken Knife looked up at the old marine.
Forgive me, brother, I have misjudged you. It seems the chapter and the plains people owe you and your warriors a great debt.
Semper Fidelis, said Cloudrunner. You must take back the suits. They belong to the chapter. Broken Knife nodded. Perhaps a favour, in honour of our dead. Leave the suits. The colour of Deathwing. The deeds of our brothers should be remembered.
It will be so,
replied Broken Knife.
Deathwing will be remembered.
The Marines turned and filed out past the dreadnought. The mighty being stood there, watching Cloudrunner with inhuman eyes. The Terminator's departure left Cloudrunner suddenly tired. He felt the weight of his years heavily. He sensed the dreadnought gazing at him and looked up. Yes, honoured ancestor, he said in the tongue of the plains people.
You could go back with us. You are worthy of becoming a living dreadnought,
he said. He wished he could return and spend his last years with his chapter, but he knew that he could not. His duty was to his people now. He must return them to the Emperor's way. He shook his head.
I thought not. You are a worthy chieftain of the people, Cloudrunner.
Any Sky Warrior would be, ancestor. Few are given the chance. Before you depart, there is something I must know. When we first met, you told me I should not become a Sky Warrior. If there was anyone I would regret leaving behind. Did you have any regrets about becoming a Marine? The dreadnought stared at him.
Sometimes I still do. It is a sad thing to leave people you care about behind, knowing they will be lost to you forever. Goodbye, Cloudrunner. We will not meet again.
The dreadnought turned and departed, leaving Cloudrunner enthroned among his people, his hands toying with a braid of ancient hair.